We now turn to Part II of Wollstonecraft and the excerpt from the Vindication of the Rights of Women. Begin by looking at her view of duties and virtues. Now, in regards to duties, she takes a view similar to that of Confucius and Aristotle, namely that people are more obligated to fulfill, their nature, and this involves moral duties. And she regards a person who fulfills their duties as being independent. Now, one question she addresses here, a fairly critical one, is a question of what women owe to themselves. And the way I always illustrate this is by using the example of the American Thanksgiving, or summer holidays, a lot of cooking and preparation, especially like Christmas, etc. But we'll stick with the example of Thanksgiving. Now, one thing that typically occurs in the traditional Thanksgiving, I remember this well from my own youth, is that the women go and they do all the cooking and preparations and so forth, and the men watch football, perhaps go at least when I was a kid back in Maine, would go deer hunting perhaps, and then come back and eat. And then after eating, watch more football, then we go deer hunting again, and then while the women are cleaning up all this stuff. And of course, there's also kind of the classic stereotypical view of the mother doing all the work for the family, cooking the food, taking the kids places, and then of course today with the mothers working, having to work as well. And there's kind of again sort of the stereotypical image of the woman always having the cold food because she's the last one who gets fed because she's so busy taking care of everyone else. Now, Wollstonecraft does address this question, this critical question of where do women's duties lie. Now, she claims that a woman's first duty is to themselves as rational creatures. Now, she's not arguing for being selfish here. She's not saying that women should simply be selfish and ignore others and just focus on their own wants, etc. But her view is that their first obligation is to themselves as rational beings. And this doesn't mean they have other obligations, because secondly, they have the obligation of citizens, and also with their mothers, the obligation of the mother as well. And so her view is it's not that women should be selfish. Her view is that women should not put themselves, low down on their basically their view of duties, that they owe themselves in a way first. And she claims that to treat women otherwise is to make them into mere dolls, as opposed to people. Now, in terms of how this will be done, much like Aristotle, when he looked at his views of habit and virtue and moral education, she believes that society should play a role in this. And she believes that someday society should be such that a man must fulfill the duties of a citizen or be despised for failing to do so. And this would, of course, also apply to women as well. That if a woman is married, that as an active citizen, she'd be equal intent to manage her family, educate her children, assist her neighbors, etc. In other words, women wouldn't simply be, sort of set aside and not be citizens. They would be citizens as well, in addition to doing other duties as well. And the same for men. Now, how does one become virtuous? Well, in the case of Aristotle, we saw, of course, through habituation. But Wollstonecraft is focusing on the challenges rather that women face. And she makes the following claims that today, of course, may seem just blindingly obvious, but were controversial in our own time. And if we consider them and look for examples, we can find that they're controversial and problematic even today, at least in the eyes of some. First, she claims, to be virtuous and useful, a woman must have the protection of the civil laws. In other words, a woman must be covered by the legal system, the same legal rights as men. Now again, today this seems probably quite obvious to us. However, if we look at the past, even in the United States, women were often treated quite differently than men, treated far worse, having less legal rights, etc. For example, one major thing that was changed not so long ago was the idea that a husband just had a right to have sex with his wife, whether she wanted to or not. And now, of course, that's no longer the case. Similarly, if you look at other countries, women can be treated in many cases as mere property or have very few rights. And so although in countries like the United States, women and men have pretty close equality in general, although it's always good to keep an eye for examples that might not fit, in other countries things can be quite different. And even in the United States, it's worth noting the differences between men and women. For example, people point out that while Viagra, which is for men, is covered by insurance, there is a terrible dispute about having birth control covered by insurance, even in cases where the birth control medicine was not intended just for birth control, but also for treating a variety of medical conditions. And so those issues still remain, even in the United States. The second point of concern here for her is that a woman should not be dependent on her husband for subsistence during his life or support after his death. Now, her reasoning for this, in part, is in regards to the virtue of generosity. Now, as you might imagine, if a person doesn't have anything of their own and who is not, free, how can they be generous? So if I'm giving away someone else's stuff, that's hardly generous of me. To be generous involves me giving away what belongs to me. And so, in this case, as she sees it, one must have possessions, have wealth, in order to be generous in this regard. And this is another indication of her view of wealth, that it's not inherently bad, it's sort of the way that it's used. And so, on the negative side, as we saw earlier, wealth can have an unfortunate effect on people, a negative effect, but she sees women having their own income as being critical to their being virtuous. Now, as she sees it, that unless women have this opportunity, they will simply be regarded as existing for the purposes of men, and she regards that as bad. Now, she sort of switches back from the positive aspects of wealth to the negative aspects of wealth, namely in the following way. Even though a woman should have the capacity to be independent financially, she believes that wealth is still an impediment to virtue and morality. Why? Well, you don't acquire virtue by speculation. You don't acquire virtue by having wealth. And she claims, in a view that's consistent with that of Confucius, that when poverty is more disgraceful than vice, morality is cut to the quick. Now, getting back to the point of society, one thing that's fairly common among virtue theorists is the idea that it's not simply a matter of the individual doing stuff to be virtuous, it's a matter for the whole society. We saw this in Confucius back in Part II of the course. We saw this in Aristotle in Part II and in the first part of this section of the course. And so, how does it fit in for her? Well, she claims that women ought to have representatives in government, instead of being arbitrarily governed without a direct share in the deliberations of government. And so her view is that women should have representatives in government, serving as politicians essentially. Now, today, of course, fast forward to now, we may think, well, surely this is the case. We had Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State. We have women in Congress and the Senate in important positions, etc. However, as people point out even today, we have not had a woman president. The majority in Congress is still male. Among the governors, still mostly men, and likewise for most positions of authority and power. And so it's well worth pointing out that even though things have clearly improved in terms of gender balance since the time of Wollstonecraft, there are still points of concern. Now, interestingly, or boringly enough, she takes the view, on the other hand, sort of critical of representation. So on the one hand, it's positive. On the other hand, she sort of looks at the system as problematic, namely that the system of representation is only a convenient handle for despotism. And she comes out basically kind of harsh against the system of royalty, namely that that there's taxes that enable the idle royalty to parade before a gaping crowd, and she sees essentially society as being sort of wasteful in regards to the use of its resources. And this is again sort of the anarchism, sort of creeping into review. Now, in regards to, more problems in regards to this, she claims that essentially one of the problems, again, getting back to wealth, is that in the superior ranks, at least in review, the real work is done by the people that are beneath them, the deputies. And she sees this as problematic because, again, she sees that people should fulfill their duties and obligations. And the vain pleasures of, the rich interfere with virtue. And the also of critical importance is that the most sacred trust, the positions of authority, influence, and power, are simply things that are handed up. So she regards the current situation of her society, or rather, in regards to our society in the past, as problematic. And in regards to women, she notes that women all want to be ladies, which is to have nothing to do, but listlessly to go where they scarcely care where. So as she sees it, what is the solution to these problems? Well, again, what she advocates won't seem very radical today. She believes that women could study the art of healing and become doctors as well as nurses, study politics, pursue business. And her view is this would be a good thing because first, it would save women from the menial and often horrible professions they possessed in the 1700s, such as prostitution and menial cleaning jobs. She also believes that women would not need to marry for support then, and simply have to find a man. They could earn their way through and basically earn respect. So she sees it. It's a view that we commonly accept today, that women should have the opportunity to pursue careers and be successful, not merely be trapped because they're women into menial occupations or degrading occupations like prostitution. Now, of course, if we fast forward to today, the opportunities for women are much broader. Women can be doctors, lawyers, politicians, pilots, combat troops, etc. But as people do, still point out, the opportunities for women are still, it is claimed, less than those for men. So it's still a point of concern, this matter of equality. Now, the final point for this part is government and virtue. Again, much like Aristotle and Confucius, she takes the view that the government should play a role in this. And as she sees it, a government that does not provide for honest, independent women to encourage them to fulfill respectable stations is defective and unmindful of the happiness of women. So her view is that what women have to get from the state, or rather earn from the state, is this: to have a civil existence in the state, whether they're married or single. In other words, that women would have the role of citizens. Also, she sees it, is that women should have the same opportunities that men have. And of course, again, from our standpoint today, this has been largely accomplished. But of course, it's still worth considering, has this been fully accomplished? And of course, we should look beyond the borders of the United States to the rest of the world to see if the same is true in other countries, which it sometimes is not. Now, that brings us to the end of Part 2 for Wollstonecraft, and next we shall proceed to Part 3.